Hello, I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to our Great Books course at Ubiquity University, which is hosted by our Wisdom School, where once a month we come together to talk about one of the great books of history that has stood the test of time, that has spoken to people across cultures, and which has transformed lives. In particular, I want to welcome our BA students who are joining for the first time. It's good for us to be together as a university, both at the graduate level and at the undergraduate level. So I want to welcome all the undergraduates to the course. As I said in my letter, this Great Books course is a little bit unusual. Normally, we have 15-week online courses, or we have learning journeys where you travel together to wonderful and exotic places. The Great Books is really like a graduate seminar where we come together and reflect very deeply. There's no quizzes. There's no real assignments other than reading the book, which you can download for free. And then at the end of the trimester, you write an essay, post paper, that summarizes your thinking and consideration of the two books that we cover each trimester. So each book, 2 months, so there's 2 lectures. And then starting today, we'll be moving from our Facebook site to the new Ubiquity platform, which you've all at the BA level have gotten accustomed to. If you haven't had the chance to look at our new website, I encourage that. And so we'll be interacting with our faculty and our students on our new platform, and we'll be sending out information about that short, because that's one of the other considerations for grade, is how interactively your discussions about the various books that we consider. I am particularly pleased to take up Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German Swiss philosopher, born in 1844 to a Lutheran pastor, grew up very precocious, went off to university and read Ludwig Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, completely lost his faith, and he then spent the rest of his life trying to discern what in fact was true at the end of the 19th century. He died in 1900, and to my mind, he brought the Western tradition as we know it, from a philosophical, theological point of view, to a close. He exercised, as he put it, philosophy with a hammer. And he thereby opened up for all of us a new way forward. I have always been a lover of all things Greek, as the faculty and the students know, because I believe that Greek civilization was easily the highest of all civilizations, at least that we know about on planet Earth. It's been said that never before have so few people excelled in so many different areas of human exploration and inquiry as did the several generations from Pericles to the death of Alexander in ancient Greece. Just about everything that we know and consider somehow or other originated in the Western tradition in Greece. And Nietzsche brought those, and he did so with a hammer. And that because it is consider over the next hour us to leave the past behind. And I want to summarize a few of the things that he took the hammer to, and then we will go into Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But if there was one great contribution of Plato and Aristotle, Pythagoras, Parmenides, it was around the supremacy of reason. The notion of the supremacy of reason may be the most impactful philosophical assertion in the intellectual history of humankind. And that was the contribution of the Greeks. They said that in the end, it is humanity's capacity to reason, to engage in logical thought, that separates us from the animals and gives us our power to be like God. The Christians, Muslims all adopted this, particularly in the medieval period, and God was equated with reason. The Enlightenment took reason and put it on the throne. You remember the French Revolution. They overthrew all the gods and they created a new goddess, the goddess of reason. And with Kant, the great German philosopher, and much of the 19th, 20th theologians, religion even had to be reasonized, made logical, because scientific empiricism, rational thought, basically conquered all. And to this, Nietzsche said no. Reason is not, in fact, the highest level of human achievement. It is our passions. Why? Because humanity is not separate from the animals. We are animals. So for anybody that the rest of the animal kingdom does not, said Nietzsche, is an illusion. We may do some things better. He says, watch a wolf pack. Watch a pride of lions hunt their prey. They use reason. They calculate geometrically the velocity of the prey. They will wait, sometimes for days, calculating. The deepest part of who we are, said Nietzsche, is our instincts, is our passion. The very thing that the Greeks and the philosophical and religious traditions worldwide have denigrated is what Nietzsche said is the most real about our humanity. The Greeks denigrated the body, along with the Abrahamic religions and the Eastern metaphysical traditions. And Nietzsche said, no, our bodies are the carriers of life. Our bodies are. Nietzsche talked about the wisdom of the stomach 100 years before it became current in Western scientific circles. The Christians had said that love, the highest reaches of love, is when love transcends eros, sexuality, and becomes pure reason, pure agape. God is love. God isn't sexual, therefore love isn't sexual. Nietzsche said no. Our sexuality, our eros, infuses everything that is. That is life. And we can sublimate it to the highest reaches of reason. But as soon as you deny the body, as soon as you deny the erotic, as soon as you deny the sexual, you cut yourself off from that which is truly alive. And that's why the Christian religion got so caught up in shame and guilt, because it denigrated the body. It denigrated the erotic. We'll have more to say on this as we move forward. Because in order for the Christian religion to suppress the sexual aspects of who we are, the physical aspects of who we are, they had to engage in what Nietzsche called a slave morality, keeping us all enslaved to conventions. Nietzsche also was the first one, actually, in the history of intellectual thought, at least that I know about, that in contradistinction with what was the common assumption that humanity was made in the image of God, we were kind of a finished product. Nietzsche said no. Humanity is a bridge. We come from the upper primates, and even as we look back on the upper primates and we say, oh, we've come a long way. So in 1,000 years, said Nietzsche, they will look back on us like we look back on the apes and say, whoa, we have come a long way. Therefore, said Nietzsche, take the hammer to everything that you've been taught and understand that your moment in your life, which is now, has one purpose: to participate in that which lies in all of us, which he called the superhuman. Because if life is evolving, our task, our sacred challenge, is to evolve it further so that we can become more refined. And the ultimate quality of the fully alive person is someone who works within all the constraints of birth and race and situation, all those constraints, and through everything that constrains and limits, to be a creative change agent, to bring something into the world that's truly beautiful. This is why I love Nietzsche, because he broke it all down. And he says there's only one thing that remains, is the earth. And we are animals on this earth. We are creatures of this earth. We carry earth in our bodies. And as long as we have breath, as long as we can think and feel and be passionate, let us be creative change agents, allowing the future to speak through us to build a new world. That, in a nutshell, is Friedrich Nietzsche. And what I would like to focus on is Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which may be the most extraordinary book in the Western philosophical tradition, because it doesn't have any footnotes, it doesn't have any bibliography. As I said last time, Nietzsche spoke in aphorisms. And just to remind us of the extraordinary nature of this book, Nietzsche was very shy. He was very sickly. He was the youngest classics professor ever hired at the University of Basel in Switzerland at the age of 24, without a PhD, without even a teaching certificate. He was so brilliant that the University of Basel welcomed him as the classics professor. But by the mid-30s, he had to resign because his body couldn't handle the voltage of what was coming through him. And then when he was about 38 years old, one of his friends, a man by the name of Paul Ray, invited him to join him and a young woman, the beautiful Lou Salome, to travel around Switzerland and Italy and look in search for the perfect place to build a commune where intellectuals could come together and talk about noble things. And Nietzsche fell madly, completely in love with Lou Salome, who went on to be an extraordinarily well-known, very gifted writer and thinker. She actually wrote one of the first intimate biographies of Nietzsche. She was a friend and confidant of Sigmund Freud, Rainer Maria Rilke, and she was sought after in the salons of Europe in the last part of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So she was an extraordinary human being. And these two human beings came together and it didn't quite fit. He proposed 3 times. And 3 times she turned him down. And then she went off with Paul Ray and they left Nietzsche without any warning by himself in a hotel. And he was completely devastated. He never recovered from that experience. It broke him. And anybody who's been deeply in love, to go through that kind of an experience may be one of the hardest things for us to go through. Unrequited love, rejected love. He went home, couldn't deal with his mother, ended up by Lake Rapallo in Italy. And as I recounted one day, as he was walking into complete dejection, what appeared in his mind was a pyramidal stone. And out of the stone as the stone enveloped him, came a voice. I am Zarathustra. And he went back to his room, and in the next 10 days, in one download, he wrote the first quadrant of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And the next 3-4 years, he had 3 more experiences, and each time in about 10 days, he wrote the next section. He published it. He considered Thus Spoke Zarathustra his greatest work. It's his most cogent work. I've often thought, because all our books, the Bible, the Quran, all that is going to recede now into the dust of history. It has to, for all sorts of reasons I don't have time to go into in this call. And our generation is called upon to create a new Bible, a new Torah, a new Quran. What brilliance will we bring to bear that will give us the text, the canonical text for the new world? Think about that. Think about that. If you had to choose what works, what writings would serve as canonical for the civilization that we are challenged to create, what would be in that canon? Well, I would submit that the first book in the canon, among others, is Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I believe it's one of those books that signal the new age by applying the hammer to that which needs to go and offering the basis for the new. And with that as a very brief preface, I want to now turn to the actual text of Thus Spoke Zarathustra and spend the balance of my time teasing out some of the themes that go to the heart of what it means to be human, fully human, in our time. And I would start with Zarathustra's Prologue, which opens the book. I read a little bit about it from it in closing last time, and so I want to open where I closed and then go from there and make some remarks. First of all, he has a very interesting statement on later on in the book, which is the preface of everything. He says the earth has a skin, and this skin has a disease, and this disease is called humanity. I just want everybody to take this in. This was written 120 years ago, before nuclear weapons, before the Holocaust, before climate change. And scientists are now beginning to conclude that humanity is acting so irresponsibly that we've become like a virus, we've become like a disease. And part of what climate change is doing, the scourge of extreme weather events, is trying to slough us off. Nietzsche saw this over 120 years ago because he could see that where the application of reason We're the application of a morality that is drawn from outside the world, from some transcendental Father God. All that was going to end up in an orgy of destruction. So in that sense, Nietzsche was prophetic. He saw that after him, après moi, le déluge, as Louis XIV said. After me, the deluge. So he wrote Zarathustra as a call to anybody who would see, anybody who would hear, that the most urgent task of humankind is to re-understand what it means to be human within the larger framework of planetary life. The eco-field of sentient being. And he does something very interesting right at the beginning. He starts out by saying that when he was 30 years old, he left his home and the lake of his home, and he went into the mountains. And there he lived in a cave. For 10 years, he lived in a cave. And he communed with the animals. And in particular, he communed, his totem animals were the eagle and the serpent. The eagle that sees far, piercing intelligence that stalks its prey. And he says that the serpent would coil around the neck of the eagle, and they would fly together. And the serpent, that which slithers on the ground, which the eagles eat, would commune with Zarathustra. The serpent, the most subtle, the wisest of all the creatures that the Lord God hath made, says Genesis. So the eagle and the serpent. Also the bear and the deer and the fish and various birds all commune with Zarathustra. So when you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he's communing with these animals all the time. And I just want to pause there because I believe, and in fact, starting next year, Ubiquity is going to establish the Institute for Interspecies Communication, because I believe that the greatest challenge of human beings is to learn how to commune with the rest of nature. All the rest of nature communes. We're the only ones that are out of the conversation. And Zarathustra, after 10 years, finally comes out of his cave one morning and he sees the sun, the piercing light of the sun. And he said to the sun, "Thou great star, what would be thy happiness if you hadn't chosen to shine for us? If you weren't shining your light, shining your love on all of us, you would have been going through your daily journey. And by now you would have become weary. But I've waited for you every morning to receive your blessing. But now I need to go down, not up toward the sun, like Icarus. I need to go down." And I want to just pause here to consider the cave. And the word that's used in the German here to go down is untergehen. And it has, the image that he is using, which is a recurring image all the way through Zarathustra, is that of not the sun, but the sun as it begins to set in the west. It goes down and the light recedes, so that there's the expectation of the darkness, but knowing that out of the darkness, the light is going to shine again. So the image that Zarathustra plays with is the image of light receding, darkness, light coming up, and the endless cycle, the myth of the eternal return, the myth of cycles of life. It's also interesting, and he again takes the hammer to. Remember Plato's very famous allegory of the cave offered in the Republic, where people are chained by their wrists and their ankles and their neck. So the back of the cave. And the elite, those that control morality, control the government, have lit a fire in the front of the cave. And so what you see in the back of the cave are the shadows. And they're taught that the shadows are real. That's the slave morality. That the shadows of consumerism, the advertisements for the iPhone, buy this and be happy, believe this and you're going to go to heaven when you die. Those are all shadows, says Zarathustra. Says Nietzsche, says Plato. Those are all shadows. And in Plato, what happens? You get out of the darkness of the cave, which has imprisoned you, and you go to the front of the cave and you see the full sun for the first time. And Nietzsche says, no, that's not the end of the matter. For Zarathustra, it's going into the cave. That is the liberation. Going into the cave is the liberation, not going out of the cave. So it's when the sun sets and darkness ascends, and we go into the darkness. We incubate in the darkness. That's where we see the most clearly. So you can see that every one of the pillars of the Western mind, Nietzsche is turning them literally on its head and saying that it is in the cave, communing with the animals, because we are animals. We're no better than the eagles. We can learn from the eagles, and we can learn wisdom from the snake. We don't run out of time. I want to talk and read some of his passages on wisdom, passages on wisdom. He goes down the mountain. And he gives his first sermon, very similar to the Buddha's fire sermon, where he enunciated the Four Noble Truths. And in this case, the truth that Zarathustra wants to enunciate is the truth of the superhuman. That we are not finished. And the image that he gives, which is one of the questions in the chat last time that I didn't get a chance to because we ran out of time, but he says there's 3 stages to becoming a superhuman. which is in the chapter on the 3 metamorphoses. He says you start out as a camel, and then you become a lion, and then you become a child. That's the pathway of the superhuman. The camel is a beast of burden. You carry all the rules, all the conventions, all the taboos that your culture and your family and your school tell you are true. So finally, you're so burdened with oughts and shoulds and fears and loathings and body denying, earth denying, transcendence of modalities of being, that you're led by the nose and you spend your life as a beast of burden. And I want to pause here. I've made a comment to a number of you that I've talked to that you're 13s in a 12 world. People show up at Ubiquity almost universally because they're refusing to be a camel anymore. They've said enough. I am not going to do that anymore. That 12 world of time, space, and causality and a slave morality is not who I am. I'm a 13. Nietzsche speaks to 13s. He is the guru of the 13. And he says, once you realize that you're nothing but a beast of burden and you break out of that, you become a lion. And why do you become a lion? Because you have to exercise great courage to break out of the cave, to look at all those shadows on the back of the cave and become liberated. And we all have our stories about how we got liberated from conventions. It takes incredible courage. It takes cunning. It takes almost a predatory instinct, says Zarathustra, because it takes great discipline. You have to be a lion to be a 13 in a 12 world. But that's only to allow you to break out. It takes a lion to break out of being a camel. But in order to break through to the superhuman, you have to become a child. You have to learn the innocence of a child, to play as a child, to laugh and to giggle like a child. And I want to just read a couple things right here about this journey from camel to lion to child. Nietzsche, or Zarathustra, says, they who wish one day to fly must learn first to stand, then to walk, then to run, and then to climb, and finally, you learn to dance. For Zarathustra, it is laughter and play and the dance that are the essential qualities of those people who are superhuman. One does not fly into flying. We want to be liberated. We see that we don't want the conventions. We want to be liberated. We want to be authentic. But you don't fly in a day, says Zarathustra. You got to go through this process. And part of the process of being a camel is you've got to learn your tradition. You have to understand your tradition before you really can be truly liberated from your tradition. And that's important. And then I want to just go into his discourses on wisdom, because he says that what leads you from camel to lion to child? It's wisdom. And therein the Greeks were right. What is a philosopher but a lover of wisdom? What is wisdom? What is wisdom? Think about it for a minute. What is wisdom? Why do philosophers love wisdom? What is it about wisdom that leads us? And I just want to share the beauty of Nietzsche's prose. Along with, he probably was the greatest writer in the German language of prose. He would be equal to Goethe in terms of poetry. With poetry, Goethe's, great Faust and his poetry. Nietzsche, his prose. And he says in one passage, "In my heart, I only love life. And I love life most when I hate life. But that I am fond of wisdom, and often too fond, is because she reminds me very strongly of life. Wisdom is what leads us into life," says Zarathustra. Think about that. Our religions, our conventions lead us away from life. But wisdom is that feminine anima quality. It's really extraordinary that universally wisdom is considered a feminine quality. And same for Nietzsche, same for Zarathustra. I'm fond of wisdom because she reminds me very strongly of life. She hath her eye, her laugh, and even her golden angle rod. Am I responsible for it, that both are so alike, wisdom and life? And when once life asked me, "Who is she then, this wisdom?" Then said I eagerly, "Ah, yes, wisdom. One thirsteth for her and is not satisfied. One looks for her, but only through veils. One only grasps through nets when one reaches for wisdom. Is she beautiful? I do not know. But the oldest carps are still lured by her. Changeable is she and wayward, this wisdom. Often have I seen her bite her lip and pass the comb through against the grain of her hair. Perhaps she is wicked and false, this wisdom, and altogether a woman. But when she speaketh ill of herself, just then does she seduce me the most." Just think about this for a second. Wisdom is one of the most mysterious qualities in existence. We follow her, but she is not easily obtained or defined. And just one further note on wisdom, because this notion that just when she's wicked, at that moment she seduces me the most, says Zarathustra. Remember, this is Zarathustra talking. The avatar. He knew a lot about wisdom. And then he has another passage. He says, For the sake of folly, wisdom is mixed in all things. Just pause here for a moment. For the sake of folly, wisdom is mixed in all things. There is no eternal reason that encompasses all, says Zarathustra, against Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the Greeks that said that reason was the ultimate. Zarathustra says no. It's not reason, but life. Thou art to me a dancing floor for divine chances. Thou art to me the table of the gods for divine dice and dice players. Do you blush when I link folly and wisdom? Do you disapprove when I say that life in its deepest recesses is a dancing floor of chance and freedom? The world, says Zarathustra, is very, very deep. The eagle and the serpent. Not the sun at its apogee, where everything is clear, but the sun as it's setting, pouring its gold into the sea. That is the moment of ambiguity. And one of the beautiful things about Nietzsche and the beautiful things about Zarathustra is the way that he handles ambiguity. I said, I think in the last lecture, that there are no straight lines in nature. And one of the reasons why there's so much ambiguity and circularity with Nietzsche and Zarathustra is because he's of the earth. Everything's circular. There's nothing straight. Whatever is straight, says Nietzsche, you take the hammer to it. If someone says that reason is absolute, well, reason has a role to play, but it's not the absolute. It mixes with passion. The good mixes with the evil, the light with the dark. And our challenge is we become a camel, then become a lion, and finally become a child, is to dance the dance of life on the threshing floor of the gods. And then I want to just comment again very briefly on the shadow. You know, we talk a lot about the shadow. And it became current, you know, really with Jung. But Nietzsche was the first one really to talk shadow in any way that we would 20 years later find relevant. And when you have time to read the book, toward the end of the book, Zarathustra meets all these people. And he has these interactions with these different people, and a group of them end up in his cave. Because they're searchers. They're 13s. And they've left the 12 world, and they're really wanting to become a lion and become a child. And as he's going along one day, he realizes that he's been followed by his shadow. So he starts to run, tries to get away. The shadow stays right with him. And then he realizes that he can't get rid of his shadow. And he first is seized by a great fear. And then he says, wait a minute. I can't be afraid of my shadow, even though it has longer legs than I do. My folly has grown as big as the mountains. And he laughed. Then he turns to his shadow and he says, who are you? Why are you here? And why do you call yourself my shadow? And the shadow says, remember the eagle and the serpent, the setting sun, the rise of the superhuman. The shadow says, I'm a wanderer who has walked long at thy heels, always on the way, but without a goal, also without a home. And so I lack little of being the eternally wandering Jew, except that I am not eternal and I'm not a Jew. So he'd wandered his whole life, he says, following Zarathustra, sort of like the wandering Jew, the archetype of the wandering Jew, going from place to place. But I'm not eternal, he says. And I'm not a wandering Jew. So Zarathustra says to him, so then who are you? Who are you, my shadow? And the shadow says, with you have I broken up whatever your heart revered. All boundary stones and statues have I overthrown. Beyond every crime you thought to commit, did I once go? You know that great line of Dante in the Divine Comedy, that he never heard of a crime that he knew in his heart he wouldn't commit under certain circumstances. With thee did I unlearn the belief in words and worth and great names. I am lying innocence. You speak the truth. I carry the lie. I want to just again, seed your thinking, your shadow content. We all have a shadow content. What is the shadow? By definition, we can't see it, but it never leaves us. And whatever our truth is, the shadow casts darkness. It's the lie. It's the lying innocence. Because it doesn't appear to be anything harmful. It's just our shadow. But it's our shadow that moves up into our psyches and leads us away from wisdom. And yet wisdom mixes the folly of the shadow to somehow lead us inexorably on our way. And I see the tyranny of the clock, so I will bring this to a close. But I want to, one thing, he says, the shadow. When the devil casts his sin, it casteth his skin, the reference to the serpent. Remember in the Garden of Eden, the serpent sloughed off its skin. And so when the devil casteth his skin, doth not his name also fall away? It is also skin. And maybe the devil himself is not the serpent, but the skin. that which we slough off to become more authentically a superhuman. When I read that, it kind of blew my mind. The devil is not, the devil out there. Mephistopheles seducing Faust. But consider, says Zarathustra, maybe the devil is your own skin. Just like you slough off your skin, you slough off the diabolic as you become more truly superhuman. And then I just want to close with the child, to say more about the child. And to say that for Nietzsche, the essence of becoming a child is the capacity to learn how to play, how to laugh, how to dance, how to create, how to adore beauty. So that in the spirit of gaiety and fun and levity, we become creative change agents in the world. And he says, what's the greatest sin on earth? Those that say, woe unto you who laugh. Boy, I know when I was growing up in a missionary school, laughter was not encouraged. We were to behave. And when I learned to laugh was when I learned to throw off the cane. And he then says, tortuously do all good things come nigh to their goal. And he says, the capacity of all good things to come nigh to their goal is because all good things laugh. All good things last. And who cometh nigh to their goal dances. They dance upon the well-swept ice. They dance by lifting their legs and standing upon their heads. The dancers wear the rose garland crowns, consecrated by their laughter. Zarathustra the dancer, Zarathustra the light ones, be good dancers. Laugh your life, said Zarathustra. Laugh your life. That's the key to your creativity. And that's why we need to become children, says Zarathustra. And ye higher men, he says, the worst thing in you is that ye have none of what you learned to dance as you ought to dance. So learn to laugh beyond yourselves. Lift up your hearts, ye good dancers. High, higher, higher. The crown of the laughter, this rose garland crown, to you, my brethren, my sisters, do I cast this crown. Laughing have I consecrated, ye higher human beings. Learn, I pray you, to laugh. And then the book closes where Zarathustra, back in his cave, speaks to the eagle and the serpent. And he says once more, I love you, my animals. My longing is to be naked, whether male or female. It does not matter. We are to be naked on this earth, communing with the animals as we take human evolution to the next stage of its natural development. And anything that keeps you from doing that has to be cast aside. And so I'll leave it there. But I think you can see from my remarks my love of Nietzsche Ubiquity University is a Nietzschean impulse. We are creating learning from the future. We are transcending the conventions, and we are dedicating ourselves to the earth. And as you all know, I mean, and this is what's up on our website, this next generation, the millennials and the Gen Zs, are going to take the hit for everything that we have left undone. Nietzsche was right. The earth has a disease, and the disease is humanity. And the earth is now beginning to slough us off. And these next generations, and I'm speaking directly to all you young people here, global problems, we're going to forfeit human civilization. And that's a growing in the world today, because climate change is spinning out of control. The thing that you need to do to leave the past behind, to focus on the fact that you are an animal, and the sacred task is to commune with earth, to align out of communion with earth, force of transcendence, without any laws that come from outside, but that which life itself will give you as you transition from being camel to lion to becoming a child. Dancing, laughing, playing, as we create the world anew. That's what Nietzsche carried. And I close with this one image. One day, Nietzsche was in Torino, in northern Italy. And he was walking along, he was alone. He saw a man beating a horse, mercilessly beating a horse. And Nietzsche burst into tears and threw himself on the horse and pushed the man away and began to hug the horse, sobbing. And that's when Nietzsche, the voltage was too much, and he went insane. He had a series of strokes, and then he died. But the image of just hugging a horse with infinite compassion and fraternal love, that was the message of Zarathustra. That's the key to becoming a lion and a child, and thereby a superhuman that aids humanity on its evolutionary way. Well, that'll bring my little remarks to a close. I'd like to have Frederich talk. I had a conversation with Frederich, and she was bringing in a very interesting piece that pertains to Zarathustra. Let's see, who else here? Kate may have something to say. Mino, I want to hear from Mino. I see Mino's on the line. I hear from Mino, who's a 13 if I ever saw one. And we'll get a couple students, and then we'll, maybe Georgia, you have something to say, and then Mark and and Will. But let's start with Farnak. Welcome, Farnak.
Hi. Hi, Jim. Thank you. Thank you for, it was a bit late, but I could catch a good bit of it. I haven't read the book yet, so I will do that. But I have an interesting, it's funny because the first journey I did with doing this series of archetypal journeys with a group of women where we combine dance and mythology. I started with Inanna, and we had the great books with Inanna, and it was all, synchronicity. And now we had arrived at the Persian goddess Anahita, which I knew very little of a year ago. In fact, I knew nothing until she visited me in a dream and did all kinds of things to my body, and half aware I could ask her, "Who are you?" And she said, "Anahita." And I was like, that's a Persian name. And then she showed me a few things to do with this feminine essence, how that was taken and what to do. And it's quite a long story. I don't want to go into that. But I, Googled when I woke up in the middle of the night, terrified of what was happening to my body. And I found out she was a Persian goddess and an ancient Zoroastrian, you call it Yazata, an angel. So I started studying Anahita. There's not much about her. She's quite vanished from the scene. It looks like it is, but going deeper, it's not. And she is so alive. It is, in my experience, because now we arrived at the event. We just had it a few days ago. And the archetypes then come and visit in the dreams more intensely than when you're not working with them. So she took me through dream after dream after dream and night, and it was so interesting to watch the Sufi lineage, which I belong to, and Anahita's ways merging in each other and the teachings coming from that. And just for my Persian, having an idea of, women are suppressed, and then to experience such a powerful goddess coming from ancient Persia, where barely anyone knows about her. So what has she to do with Zoroaster is that, before the Zoroastrian temples, in the research I have done, it is said that the temples that were the fire temples, where the sacred fire was worshipped, was Anahita's temples. And they were built next to waterfalls because one of her elements is water. And so I just wanted to just bring that in, the image of the waterfall temples, the water where the goddess was worshipped, was replaced with the fire of masculine consciousness, which Zarathustra brought in. But he included Anahita. Anahita was included in the religion, and she was given an angelic position. So just to have that awareness of that moment of the lunar consciousness going into a solar one, Anahita carrying the wisdom of the lunar, passing that on to Zarathustra. It seems, if you look at the pagan, quality in the religion, and he brought that masculine solar consciousness in a very healthy way through where the goddess is included, and the goddess being Anahita. Another side note is that I found out Anahita was never really gone, because I found out the Sari, the Persian, in the Persian poetry, where the woman pours the wine into the cup of the men who are like, "Give me more, I'm, all drunk." And I was secretly thinking, was it perhaps that Anahita went undercover through this, Sufi love affair? She was still worshipped. This archetype, this feminine archetype, never really was, would you say it? She wasn't rejected in that way. Well, that just warms my own heart to think, okay, you know, this Persian goddess stayed alive. She found a way. She found her way through the patriarchal time. And maybe now is the time that she's coming back to consciousness, because I had 2 dreams where she named herself. There was a voice, and I've never had that before with an archetype. So just
Good. Well,
wanted
thank
to
you.
bring in Anahita.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted Farnak's remarks, because that masculine feminine balance in the Zoroastrian tradition goes way back to its origins, and it's an important aspect. So, Georgie, do you have any comment?
Sure, I always do. Well, thank you very much, Jim. It was another rich and fantastic lecture of yours. I always enjoy listening to you. I'm just not sure that how my internet connection is holding up, because Europe, or rather Hungary, is overheating. So with your permission, I may switch off my camera. So I just wanted to show myself that I'm alive, and this is not a robot speaking with a Hungarian accent. But there is, so let me just switch off the camera. Well, it was really interesting for me to reread Nietzsche's book. So thank you again, Jim, for reintroducing it to me. And why it was so interesting for me, because when I read it first, I loved it then, but even now, I enjoyed it so much for the reason that I have changed since I read it. And as I was reading the book, I started to make comments on a piece of paper, or rather some short notes. And as I was going on, my eyes were almost bulging out because I started to see some Buddhist overtone from Nietzsche's words. And let me just kind of like say all my comments, and I would like to hear your view on this. So the first things I started to write down was, all events will repeat themselves over and over. And one has trouble facing the eternal reoccurrence unless improvement takes place. The overman, the Übermensch, has moved beyond the concept of good and eternal recurrence. So this is some sort of enlightenment, some kind of recognition of the samsara. So the English translation, the overman, the Übermensch, which is something I think a bit different in German, but let's not get into. I think for me that equals with overcoming. So to improve, I must overcome myself. So I was thinking that I think Nietzsche speaks of humans as being part creator and part creator. And that our refinement consists in the fact that the creator in us can torture and reshape the creature in us. So I think that's really an interesting point of view, and maybe you could say something about that. But my really last point is that what Gilles Deleuze, the famous French philosopher, said, that there is no such thing as being, but rather becoming. So may I say that Zarathustra's returning, what Nietzsche said, is the being of becoming, the eternal recurrence, thus expresses the fundamental nature of the universe, and only the overman sees every moment of this life as a creation of his own will, i.e. karma. So I was like, oh my God, Nietzsche was a Buddhist. So I started to research that, was it true? And I found several references that Nietzsche read Schopenhauer, whom we know he was very much influenced by Indian and Buddhist thought. And apparently Nietzsche said that, we know he was very critical of all religions, but he said once that Buddhism was the most realistic one. So anyway, this is my comment, Jim.
Well, thank you. Just to underscore a couple things that you said. I mean, Nietzsche would applaud this notion that we're part creature and part creator. but that our creatureliness is what shapes our creativity. And he had this whole notion of the myth of the eternal return that he embraced very strongly against the Judeo-Christian Islamic notion of linear time, and then you go to heaven or hell for eternity. Not true in Judaism, but Christianity and Islam. Nietzsche said no. The sun always goes down and it comes back up. That life is a cyclic reoccurrence. And it's because everything is interconnected. And because everything is interconnected, everything is always morphing into something else. And the other point that you made, which is fundamental to Nietzsche, is the notion, not that you be who you are as a static phenomenon, but that you become who you are. Everything is dynamic. And that was his great no to Parmenides and Plato, the notion that being was that God, of Aristotle, God of Aquinas, the Christian God, is the unmoving being, and anything that moves is somehow lesser. For Nietzsche, everything moves, and moves the whole, can't think of who it would come to me in a moment, the whole universe breathes together. That would be very much Nietzsche's notion as well. And so, yeah, well, thank you. Those are all good comments. And the thing I love about Nietzsche is that he got all the major issues, with the exception, I would say, Nietzsche, the one thing where I think he can be rightly criticized was that he didn't have a particularly elevated view of women. He had very unfortunate relationships with women personally, with his mother and grandmother when he was young, who were kind of suffocating. And then with Lou Salome, never did consummate a loving relationship. And I think that kind of distorted his view of women. But on all the other issues, particularly the issue of earth consciousness, something that we are just discovering today as if it's for the first time, but has actually been articulated by a century and a half ago, so that we have a lot to learn from Nietzsche, to be sure. Mark, why don't you say something, and then maybe Will.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I'm a little hesitant today because I always share your enthusiasms with our readings and our figures, but I find an exception here. But I think it's probably worth the discussion to point out some of the shadow elements, to use the term you used very well in the presentation, that come to mind when we deal with Nietzsche. And now, because of how I interpreted what was on the website, I focused my reading on Beyond Good and Evil, written in 1800 as Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I find much to admire about it, but when he turns to social policy and political thought, we run into, I think, very problematic territory. There's an extremely strong emphasis on superiority, rank, hierarchy, and that is in conflict with a sense of compassion. To me, a viable political philosophy has compassion somehow at the heart of it. And Nietzsche very explicitly argues against compassion because it gets in the way of evolution. So, for example, to be explicit, he will say, men, as among all other animals, there is a surplus of defective, diseased, degenerating, infirm, and necessarily suffering individuals. And then we'll go on to say that to attack religion because of its sympathy for these creatures. He's talking about religion here, when they had given comfort to sufferers, courage to the oppressed and despairing, a staff and support to the helpless, when they had allured from society into convents and spiritual penitentiaries the brokenhearted and distracted, what else had they to do in order to work systematically in that fashion for the preservation of all the sick and suffering, which means indeed in truth to work for the deterioration of the European race. And he goes, regarding the Buddhism, there's a lot of anti-Buddhism in this. He even goes so far as to say, because of its emphasis on passion, Europe is under the danger of, it is threatened by the potential rise of his exact term. Europe seems to be threatened with a new Buddhism because of its, because of the emphasis in the Christian world at the time on compassion. And that, now we touched last time on how Nietzsche, with this sense of rank and hierarchy, that he was appropriated by the Nazis, and mentioned how his sister was who was seen as his closest interpreter for a long time, was a dedicated Nazi herself. And Jim correctly pointed out last time that Nietzsche was not anti-Semitic. He considered the Jews among the superior races, but he does set the philosophical ground for a very invidious comparison of race and ethnicity and class. He speaks very directly in Beyond Good and Evil against any mingling of classes and races. He argues for racial purity. He stereotypes other nationalities, dismissing the English as a coarse-mannered people wholesale. Not something that was ignored by the Nazi regime either. And you mention his concerns, the concerns about his attitudes towards women, but it seemed to me that they draw on, those attitudes they're part of the fabric of much of his social and political thought. And for example, just to reinforce this point here, let me just read you a few passages here. Women wish to be independent, and therefore she begins to enlighten men about women as she is. This is one of the worst developments of the general uglifying of Europe. And he goes on to say, to dream here of equal rights, equal training, equal claims and obligations, that is a typical sign of shallow-mindedness. A man who has depth of spirit as well as desires also has the depths of benevolence, which is capable of severity and harshness, and can only think of women as Orientals do. He must conceive of her as a possession, a confinable property, as being predestined for service and accomplishing her mission therein. And it goes on like that. One last passage very quickly. To emphasize the loquacity and dissuade man from the idea that women must be preserved, cared for, protected, and indulged like some delicate, strangely wild, and often pleasant domestic animal. He's actually defending that notion. The clumsy and indignant collection of everything of the nature of servitude and bondage, which the position of woman in the hitherto existing order of society has entailed and still entails, as though slavery were a counter-argument and not rather a condition of every higher culture, every elevation of culture. He goes on to speak of a pro-slavery way about how some of these denigrated races, classes must be kept in in a slave situation. So, and that's all, it feeds in, it's part of this whole view of rank and hierarchy, which he defends in terms of evolution along with the social
Mark, let me just cut you off here because I want to get one of them running out of time, but I think we get your drift.
Okay.
I would, because I want to get Kate, who's been waiting. I think just to make a very brief comment on your remarks, I think, how to put this the most concisely, I think the nature of Nietzsche's rhetoric was polemical. And I think that's the aphoristic nature of his remarks. And so I think some of the things that you're taking and using against him, in my view, are more polemics against the system rather than issues that he himself believed in. So, for example, the notion of the class and the aristocracy and the statements against compassion, he would say that was not true compassion. That what the Christians did to love and what the Christians did to compassion was to so distort it that it became the antithesis of what it truly was. And if you, for example, he was always very affirmative about someone like Jesus, but he decried what the Christians did to Jesus. So I think you have to be careful about parsing, where Nietzsche was actually coming from in his remarks, because I think if you're not careful, you can lose track of the deeper plot line and the reason for his attack on something like, say, Christianity or compassion. He wasn't against compassion. He was against the way it had been perverted by the Christian church. And so I just want to, we could go into a long discussion on that, but I would just leave with that thought to ponder. But I wanted to get Kate, if there's any comment that Kate has, and I know we're running out of time. I was also trying to have some room for Will, but we may not make it, Will, unless we can do it very shortly. But Kate, what is your view on these matters?
Well, like I said to you, Jim, privately, I read Nietzsche when I was 14 years old, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I read that book when I was 14 years old, and it really blew my mind. And I can clearly remember putting the book down and thinking that nothing that I had ever thought was true at all. And set up, I agree with Georgie, I'm sure right after that I got into Buddhism, and which seemed like a natural path after that. I do think that, in response to Mark's comment, that, from a sort of integral view, I wouldn't expect Nietzsche to have a world-centric view, living in the culture that he was living in then and at this historical time. So I don't think that would, and I also agree with you, Jim, that he truth itself, truth and falsehood and all that. So I don't think that when he was making these kind of comments, that he necessarily, like you said, that was he was putting forth truth, because he kind of blew up that whole idea, that whole concept. I do think, and the word compassion, I don't know what the translation of that was, but I know that he really didn't like pity, and that was the kind of thing that he really didn't have any compassion for. Pity. So, I don't know. Nietzsche's just so complex. When I'm reading this book again, I just realize I want to read it like 4 more times.
Yeah.
You know, to get it at this stage of my life. I just think it's just great to pick it up again. I'm really glad you chose this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would make as a general comment, and then we'll turn to you for a final comment, is that Nietzsche was, as my reading, and I think many philosophical commentators would agree, was essentially apolitical. He didn't have very strong views of the politics of the time. He was addressing humanity at the level of existential culture. How do we get out of the slave morality that had created the horrendous cruelties and exploitation and distortions of the original impulses of the civilization? Because he could see, as I indicated, that the human race had become a disease on the earth. So he was fighting his way through all that to get people to wake up to the fact that there was a whole other way to conceive of being human. And that's why he talks about philosophy with a hammer. But I'll leave it there. Will, any final comment that you'd like to make?
Yeah, just a brief comment. One is that if you look into those interpreters of, very few people are able to get to the essence of what he had to say like you have.
Next month, we're going to turn to one of the most extraordinary writers in the world today, Anne Barron, who's written 2 monumental books, one on the goddess. And the second one that we'll be taking up is called The Dream of the Cosmos, a huge book that may be one of the most comprehensively brilliant works of the great global problematique of our time, certainly that I've read. And so over the next 2 months, July and August, next month, Will Tagle is going to interview Anne. And then in August, I will interview Anne. She wanted to do it that way. And we'll be sending out to everybody, I said already, portions that you can download of her work to give you a sense of who she is. But one of the extraordinary teachers, Jungian scholars, and great spirits of the 20th and 21st century, Anne Barron. We'll be contemplating her next 2 months. So thank you, everyone. And remember, we need to now carry forward our dialogue on our new platform, and we'll send you all out information for that over the next couple of days. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.